Jessica Monroe lost everything the night her family was forced out of the only home they'd ever known. And she thought starting over in a broken-down house with two grieving children would be her hardest challenge. But when a secret inheritance surfaces, old enemies return, and the fight for her children's future becomes a battle against power and legacy. Jessica must choose between running from the past or standing up for the life they've built. Therefore, as storm clouds gather and the world tries to take away what little hope they have left, Jessica discovers that sometimes the greatest treasures are found in the courage to begin again. Will she hold her family together, or will the past claim everything? Subscribe now and follow Jessica's journey, where every loss hides a new beginning. They say every home has a heartbeat. But tonight, as thunder rattled the tall windows of the Langston estate, Jessica Monroe felt nothing but hollow silence pulsing through its gilded halls. Shadows danced along the marble floors, flickering under ornate chandeliers, while the storm outside threatened to wash the world clean of its illusions. A cardboard box, damp at the corners, sagged in Jessica's arms. She glanced down. Her daughter Chloe's stuffed rabbit, its ear nearly torn off, stared up with glassy, rain-speckled eyes. Beside her, Mason gripped another box, shoes squeaking against the polished floors, jaw clenched so tight the muscles in his young face trembled. 7 years old, and already learning how to carry burdens much too heavy. Behind them, the mansion's golden lights blurred and bled into the storm, warm against the night, but impossibly far. Jessica caught one last glimpse of the great staircase, the portrait of Daniel and his parents looming above, her husband's smile forever trapped in oil and canvas, unchanging, unreachable. The doors swung open with a groan. Rain swept in, biting at her cheeks and soaking the frayed knees of her jeans. She wanted to shield the twins from the worst of it, but the umbrella was somewhere at the bottom of a moving box, lost among legal documents and half-folded sweaters. A voice, sharp as cut glass, sliced through the thunder. "You have until midnight, Jessica. Please don't make this harder than it needs to be." She didn't turn. Edward Langston's presence was as cold as the rain, and Victoria, statuesque in her silk robe, hovered just behind, arms folded like wings clipped too young. There was no warmth in their eyes, only relief that the family name, at last, would be purified. Jessica nudged the twins forward. Chloe shivered, a small sob buried in her throat. Mason looked back, his gaze fierce, defiant, a soldier on the wrong side of a war he never started. The driveway stretched ahead, slick and black, lined by hedges manicured to military precision. At the curb, a taxi idled, headlights misted with rain. The driver watched them in the mirror, face unreadable. As they walked, the boxes grew heavier. Jessica's arms burned, muscles screaming, but she kept moving. Each step was an act of defiance, a promise to her children that no storm, no matter how cruel, could wash away the memory of love. Why did it come to this? The question echoed inside her, tangled with grief and rage. She'd tried so hard to fit in. She'd smiled at the right dinners, learned the rules of quiet humiliation, and let their cutting remarks slide off her back. For Daniel, for the children. But it was never enough. A sudden gust flipped the lid off Chloe's box, sending a cascade of colored pencils across the walk. Chloe froze, panic in her wide blue eyes. Jessica crouched, gathering the pencils with shaking hands, fingers numb from cold. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered, her breath clouding in the night air. "We'll pick them up together, one by one." Mason set down his box, knelt beside them. The three of them huddled in the storm, collecting spilled dreams off the ground. A family unmade and remade in a single moment, not by blood or legacy, but by the quiet grace of staying when everything else falls apart. The taxi door swung open with a clatter. Jessica ushered the children inside, stowing the battered boxes at their feet. Chloe pressed her face to the glass, watching the lights of the estate fade as the car pulled away, swallowed by the curtain of rain. For a moment, Jessica allowed herself a single glance back. She saw Victoria's silhouette in the doorway, unmoved by their exile, while Edward turned away, already erasing them from memory. The mansion's windows glowed like a ship in a storm, safe, golden, and utterly unreachable. In the cab's back seat, the silence thickened. Chloe clung to her rabbit. Mason stared at his sneakers, blinking hard. Jessica rested her head against the cool glass, the weight of the night pressing into her bones. Her mind circled the last words Daniel had spoken to her, just days before the accident. A phrase that returned now, bittersweet as lullaby. "Whatever happens, Jess, you keep going. Promise me." Outside, the city passed in watery blurs. Neon signs, bus stops, shuttered cafes. Every block pulled them further from the only life they'd known. Yet somewhere inside the fear, a stubborn ember burned. Jessica tightened her arms around the twins. "We are not broken. We are beginning again." The cab finally stopped in front of a motel. Cheap, anonymous, lights flickering in the rain. Jessica paid in crumpled bills, thanked the driver, and shouldered the boxes once more. Up cracked concrete steps, under the indifferent neon glow, into a room that smelled of old smoke and lemon cleaner. Inside, the children clambered onto a sagging bed. Jessica set the boxes down, wiped her face on her sleeve, and listened to the rain drumming against the window. For the first time since the funeral, she let herself cry. Not from weakness, but from the fierce, wild need to keep going. Tomorrow, she would have to be strong again. But tonight, the rain was hers, and the love of two children, huddled close, was all the shelter she needed. A motel lamp hummed softly, casting a faded circle of light over the threadbare comforter where Jessica sat. The children, finally asleep, curled up together as if refusing to be parted even in dreams. The rain had softened outside, drumming a steadier, almost gentle rhythm on the thin window. But Jessica's mind wandered backward, searching for something warmer than this borrowed night. There had been a time when rain meant something different, when it was a curtain of possibility, not exile. She let herself slip into memory, letting the past wrap around her shoulders like Daniel's old jacket, heavy and familiar. They'd met in the narrow, half-lit aisle of a corner bookstore on Boylston Street. Jessica was running late for a shift, books in one arm, coffee in the other, almost tripping over Daniel as he knelt in front of the poetry section. The collision was clumsy, their apologies overlapping, but it left her smiling for the rest of the day. Later, she found a scrap of paper tucked inside one of her purchased books. "The rain makes the world new again. Would you meet me for coffee just once? D." Their first date was exactly that. Coffee, nothing fancy, just the kind poured into thick white mugs at a diner where the waitress called everyone honey. Daniel's laugh had filled up the space, cutting through the clatter of cutlery and the soft jazz on the radio. He'd listened more than he talked, head cocked slightly, blue eyes bright with mischief and hope. They had nothing, really. Jessica worked double shifts. Daniel was finishing his grad degree, The only luxury they could afford was time. They'd walk for miles through Boston Commons, hands brushing, collecting fallen leaves and city sounds. Once they bought a slice of apple pie to share, eating it straight from the box on a park bench while the world hurried past them, umbrellas bobbing like lanterns in the dusk. She remembered how Daniel would pause in the middle of a crosswalk just to watch the city lights flicker on one by one. "See that?" he'd say, squeezing her hand. "The world's not waiting for us. We get to make our own pace." There was resistance from the start. The Langstons, old Boston money, colder than any New England winter, considered Jessica a passing shadow, an inconvenience Daniel would outgrow. But he hadn't. He wore their disapproval like a second-hand suit, ill-fitting, easily shrugged off in her presence. Their wedding was small, almost secret. A handful of friends in a borrowed backyard, plastic chairs, wildflowers in mason jars. Daniel's vows weren't perfect. His voice cracked. He laughed at the wrong moment. But Jessica never doubted a single word. When he looked at her, she felt visible in a way she'd never known before. Chosen. The years that followed were built from that same simplicity. Nights spent playing board games with no missing pieces, weekend breakfasts with pancakes always a little burnt. The twins were born on a stormy September morning, Daniel holding her hand through every hour, naming Chloe after Jessica's grandmother and Mason after a character in an old novel they both loved. Even as they moved into the Langston estate, at Daniel's insistence, a gesture toward reconciliation, Jessica held on to the small rituals, packing his lunches with handwritten notes, making time for quiet walks, even when money and patience ran thin. She believed, perhaps naively, that love could bridge any distance. But beneath every moment, shadows lingered. The way Edward's gaze lingered too long at dinner. Victoria's habit of correcting Jessica's every word. The slight tightening of her jaw when Jessica spoke of her own parents, long gone. Still, Daniel stood by her. "If you ever doubt yourself, Jess, remember this was always our choice." Jessica blinked back to the present. Motel walls closing in. The ache of longing, sharper now, pressed into her ribs. What she wouldn't give to relive one of those ordinary afternoons. Just coffee, just laughter, nothing at stake but each other's company. On the bedside table, Chloe's drawing, a family of 3 under a rainbow, lay beside Daniel's wedding band. Jessica slipped the band onto her thumb, feeling the weight, the promise it carried. Even now, in the aftermath of everything lost, the memory of simple love offered a strange kind of steadiness. The storm had passed outside. A faint orange glow from the city's streetlights crept in, touching the children's faces, painting them gold for a moment. Jessica traced their silhouettes, heart bruised but determined. The past was gone, but the love they built, quiet, ordinary, stubborn, remained, an anchor in the shifting tides of grief. And as she closed her eyes, she promised herself, no matter how far they fell, she would carry these memories forward, letting them guide her and the children towards something gentler. Not the life they'd dreamed, but a life still worth fighting for. The morning Daniel collapsed, sunlight was falling soft and golden across the kitchen table. Jessica remembered the smell of coffee drifting through the old house, the low hum of the refrigerator, Chloe and Mason arguing quietly over who got the last blueberry muffin. A typical start to a Saturday. Ordinary, peaceful, the kind of day you look back on and don't realize was precious until it's gone. Daniel's hand trembled as he reached for his mug. At first, Jessica thought nothing of it. They were both tired. Long nights, restless kids, the new demands of the estate. But when the cup slipped and crashed to the floor, shattering into a dozen pieces, Daniel's whole arm followed. His body buckled, face pale and eyes unfocused. The ambulance arrived with its chorus of sirens and flashing lights. Mason stood barefoot in the hallway, holding his stuffed lion. Chloe clung to Jessica, silent, eyes wide with questions Jessica couldn't answer. She knelt, steadying Daniel's head, whispering his name over and over, hoping he'd find his way back through the haze. It turned out to be his heart, a diagnosis that would haunt their days and nights from then on. In and out of hospitals, Daniel shrinking inside hospital gowns, his laughter thinning. Jessica learned the language of medications, monitored heart rates, measured each breath as if the world depended on it. The children grew quieter, coloring pictures for their father, leaving them on the sterile windowsills of his hospital rooms. With each visit, the Langstons' presence grew more stifling. Edward arrived in crisply pressed suits, eyes scanning charts but never settling on Jessica. Victoria brought baskets of fruit and brisk instructions, correcting the way Jessica fluffed Daniel's pillow or arranged his flowers. One afternoon, Jessica overheard them in the hallway, voices sharp and urgent. She never should have been part of this family. Victoria's words slithered through the door. If Daniel listened to us, he wouldn't be here. She's run him into the ground. Edward's reply was colder. She's not equipped, Victoria. Not for this life, not for him. When the time comes, we'll have to step in. Jessica stood in the shadow of that conversation for weeks. At night, she'd watch Daniel sleep, his chest rising and falling in fragile rhythm, and wonder if love alone could keep a heart beating. At home, tension seeped into every corner. Dinners grew quiet. The children tiptoed around invisible landmines. Jessica's every move felt scrutinized. The groceries she chose, the stories she told, the way she managed the help. Victoria offered advice she never wanted, couched in politeness so sharp it drew invisible blood. Jessica, have you considered a nutritionist? Daniel always seemed healthier before you started cooking for him. Edward began keeping records, expenses, medications, even Jessica's hours spent away from Daniel's bedside. She felt them building a case, stone by stone, for a battle she hadn't agreed to fight. Yet, there were small moments of light. Sometimes, Daniel would reach for her hand in the quiet of a hospital room, his grip weak but steady. Don't let them get to you, Jess. You're my home. You always were. One winter night, snow drifted against the window, thick and silent. Jessica sat by Daniel's bed, telling him stories about their early days, how they'd once lost power and played cards by candlelight, how Chloe and Mason had built a fort out of couch cushions and blankets. Daniel smiled, eyes glassy but warm. Promise me you'll keep them safe, he whispered, voice thin as a thread. She squeezed his hand, pressing her forehead to his. I promise, as long as I breathe. Still, the days grew heavier. Jessica juggled childcare, hospital visits, the icy glances of in-laws who never saw her as enough. She learned to hide her exhaustion, folding pain into the corners of her smile, rationing hope like sugar in a war. The children noticed more than she realized. Chloe's drawings darkened, stick figures walking beneath clouds that rained blue streaks. Mason grew quick to anger, bursting into tears over spilled milk or tangled shoelaces. Sometimes, at night, Jessica would slip into their room and watch them sleep, Chloe's arm thrown across her brother, Mason's brow furrowed, even in dreams. She'd brush stray hairs from their faces, her touch the only shield she could offer against a world that seemed to be unraveling. Outside, the first crocuses poked through the snow. Spring whispered of change, but inside the Langston estate, the walls only closed tighter. Jessica held on, day by day, to the belief that love, messy, imperfect, stubborn, could still hold a family together, even as the world threatened to pull it apart. The night Daniel died, the world shifted, subtly at first, as if the air grew heavier, and each sound in the house rang a little sharper, echoing off the polished floors and thick curtains. Jessica was awake long before the call came. She'd grown accustomed to the strange rhythms of worry, the way her heart raced at every late-night ring, every footfall in the hallway. This time, the voice on the other end was a doctor, measured, practiced, already distant. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Monroe." He went peacefully. Words that meant nothing and everything all at once. At the hospital, she found Daniel small and still, his hands folded neatly across his chest. The machine's lights had gone dark, the room filled only with the soft click of the clock and the faint smell of antiseptic. Jessica sat beside him for a long time, tracing the lines of his fingers, whispering thanks and goodbyes. Words that caught in her throat, half-formed. She tried to memorize the slope of his jaw, the gentle arch of his brow, the little scar by his lip from the first time he tried to teach Chloe how to ride a bike. She pressed her forehead to his and promised, once again, that she'd keep the children safe. The world outside felt impossibly far away. The funeral was held on a clear, cold day. Sunlight slanted through stained glass, coloring the pews with fleeting reds and blues. The twins, dressed in black, sat silent beside her. Chloe's hand wound tightly around Jessica's fingers. Mason's shoulders stiff and square as he blinked at the altar. Friends from every chapter of Daniel's life came to pay respects. Colleagues, neighbors, old college friends. People whose names Jessica barely remembered, but who seemed to know her sorrow intimately. Edward and Victoria took their places at the front, faces set in lines of dignified grief. Victoria wept quietly, a lace handkerchief pressed to her lips. Edward's jaw was clenched, eyes fixed on the coffin, his hand resting protectively over the family crest pinned to his chest. After the service, while mourners gathered in subdued clusters, the Langstons approached. Victoria's voice was gentle but steely. "We're very sorry for your loss, Jessica. Truly. But you must understand, the children, they belong to the Langston legacy. They need stability, tradition. We want what's best for them." Edward's eyes were colder, harder. "We'll be pursuing custody, effective immediately, for their sake, and for Daniel's memory." Jessica felt the ground drop away beneath her. Chloe, sensing the tension, pressed closer, her small body trembling. Mason's face darkened, chin jutting forward. "They're my children," Jessica managed, voice low but clear. "I will not let you take them." A hush fell over the room. For a moment, it seemed like the church itself was holding its breath. Victoria's eyes softened, but her words did not. "Think of their future, Jessica. We'll do whatever is necessary." In the days that followed, the Langstons made good on their threat. Legal letters arrived, thick envelopes with the family crest stamped in gold. Jessica found herself alone against a storm of lawyers and accusations, claims of unfitness, of lacking the means to provide sound, of putting the children at risk by refusing to honor Daniel's wishes. There was talk of money, of estates, of responsibility. Nowhere, Jessica noticed, was there talk of love. She spent her nights filling out forms, scanning bank statements, gathering every scrap of evidence that she was, in fact, a mother. The old estate seemed to shrink around her, every room heavy with ghosts and memories, each hallway echoing with Daniel's laughter and the children's running feet. Yet everywhere she turned, she met closed doors, whispered warnings, staff who averted their eyes. One morning, a moving van appeared at the gates. Jessica packed what she could: clothes, photographs, Chloe's favorite blanket, Mason's battered baseball glove. There was no time for goodbyes, no space for anything but survival. She led the children down the drive, heads held high, the mansion's stone facade reflecting nothing but the blue of a merciless sky. Neighbors watched from behind curtains. The twins kept silent, arms full of memories too heavy to carry. At the curb, Jessica knelt and gathered them close. "We still have each other," she whispered. "No matter where we go, that's enough." They left behind everything familiar: wealth, security, the illusion of family unity, and stepped out into the uncertain brightness of morning, hearts bruised but unbroken, determined to make a new life on their own terms. The old house on Willow Street didn't look like much. Its porch sagged, the paint peeled in strips, and the roof let in more rain than it kept out. Still, Jessica signed the lease with trembling hands, her name scrawled next to promises she could barely keep. First month, last month, a deposit cobbled together from what little savings remained after the legal battles. The landlord, Mr. Grady, barely glanced at her before handing over a ring of tarnished keys. Inside, the place felt forgotten. Spiderwebs stretched across high corners, dust thick enough to write stories in. The twins explored quietly, Chloe trailing her fingers along faded wallpaper, patterned with yellow roses. Mason testing every creaking floorboard, as if the house might tip and slide them back into another world. On that first night, thunder rolled in again. Always the rain, as if the sky refused to let her grieve in peace. Jessica lay on a thin mattress between the children, listening to water drip steadily into a pot she'd placed beneath the worst leak. Her thoughts flickered from Daniel's warm laugh to the echoing loneliness of the estate, and then forward, stubbornly, to what might come next. The days blurred into each other, but Jessica moved forward by necessity, not choice. She rose before sunrise, fixing peanut butter sandwiches by flashlight, rousing the twins with whispered encouragement. She hustled across town on tired feet, dropping Chloe and Mason at school before hurrying to her first job, a graveyard shift at Kelly's Diner, where she poured coffee for night shift nurses and insomniac regulars. In the afternoons, she scrubbed offices downtown, the scent of bleach and old paperwork clinging to her clothes. Evenings were for crafts, her hands aching as she knotted beaded bracelets, photographing them under the yellow bulb of the kitchen and listing them for sale online. The money never stretched far enough. Bills piled up on the kitchen table, each envelope more threatening than the last. Still, the children noticed little things, how Jessica always found a way to split the last apple 3 ways, how she made a game of counting the coins in the jar labeled house fund, how the house, drafty as it was, grew warmer with each picture Chloe taped to the walls. If there was any luck left, it showed up in small, unexpected ways. Their next-door neighbor, Mrs. Clara Johnson, was the first to knock. She appeared one Sunday morning, balancing a pie and a stack of blankets, her gray hair pulled back, and her smile as bright as a porch light. "I heard Little Feet and Big Worries moved in next door," she said, handing the pie to Chloe. and blankets to Mason. "Welcome to Willow Street. If you need anything, just shout through the fence. I can hear better than I let on." Later that week, Marcus Lee, a carpenter whose workshop filled the block with the sweet smell of sawdust, dropped by with a toolbox and a gentle laugh. "Noticed you've got a door that sticks," he offered, kneeling to adjust the hinges. "Let me know if you need shelves or a sturdy lock." The twins adjusted, each in their own way. Chloe drew bright rainbows on every scrap of paper she found, taping them in the leakiest corners as if color alone could mend the roof. Mason gathered neighborhood kids for pickup games in the empty lot, his battered glove a badge of courage. Sometimes, Jessica let herself watch the world outside. From the kitchen window, she saw the rhythm of the neighborhood. Kids biking, women tending tomatoes, the mailman whistling an off-key tune. She found comfort in the everyday rituals, hanging laundry alongside Mrs. Johnson, trading soup recipes with other mothers, learning the names of stray cats that wandered through their yard. One Saturday, the community rallied for a block cleanup. Jessica and the twins joined, raking leaves, hauling bags of trash, and painting the playground fence a cheerful blue. Chloe beamed as she dipped her brush. Mason raced Marcus to the top of the slide. That evening, tired and splattered with paint, they shared a potluck dinner under string lights, laughter and music spilling out into the street. For the first time in a long while, Jessica let herself exhale. The house was still old, the future uncertain, but within these cracked walls and patched ceilings, something unexpected was taking root. It wasn't the life she'd lost, but it was real. A tapestry of small kindnesses, laughter, and the steady hope of new beginning. On an ordinary Wednesday, Jessica was folding laundry when the knock came, steady, polite, but insistent enough to raise her guard. She wiped her hands on her jeans and peeked through the curtain. A man stood on the porch, briefcase in hand, raincoat neatly buttoned despite the clear sky. "Mrs. Monroe?" he asked as she opened the door, voice measured but not unkind. "My name is Richard Evans. I'm an attorney representing your late husband's estate. May I have a moment of your time?" Jessica led him into the kitchen, suddenly aware of every chipped mug and coloring book splayed open on the table. Chloe and Mason watched from the hallway, whispering in the code of siblings. Another stranger, another adult with answers they didn't want. Evans set the briefcase down, producing a thick, sealed envelope with Jessica's name written in Daniel's neat, slanting script. Her chest tightened. "This is from Daniel. He left instructions that it be delivered after certain conditions were met." She took the envelope, fingers trembling. The kitchen faded away. She was back in a hospital room, holding Daniel's hand, promising she'd carry the children through anything. Evans waited as she opened the letter, a hush settling in the room. The note was brief, but every word held Daniel's warmth. "Jess, if you're reading this, I'm not by your side anymore, and I hate that. But I needed to make sure you'd be taken care of, and that the kids could chase their dreams no matter what happened. I set up a trust fund, not for luxury or easy living, but for family, education, and giving back to the community that made us. I know you'll do the right thing. All my love." Daniel. Jessica barely noticed Evans's explanation. Words like 200 million, irrevocable trust, strict disbursement conditions, floating through the air like language from another universe. Her hands shook as she set the letter down. $200 million. It felt absurd, unmoored from reality, as if she'd stumbled onto the plot of someone else's life. Evans continued, detailing how the trust could only be used for the children's education, for their home, for supporting causes in their community. No lavish cars, no stock speculation, no way for the Langstons to seize control. Daniel's foresight was breathtaking and daunting. When the attorney left, Jessica sat alone in the kitchen, the letter before her, sunlight dappling the faded tablecloth. Mason padded in, hair sticking up, Chloe close behind. "Who was that?" Mason asked, climbing onto a chair. Jessica hesitated, searching for the right words. "He brought a message from Daddy. He left us something. To help us. And to help others, too." The children's faces brightened, but Jessica's mind raced. Relief warred with dread. The money could save them, lift every weight, but it could also draw attention, stir envy, change the delicate fabric of their small, hard-won happiness. She pictured the Langstons' faces if they learned the truth. Another battle, more courtroom lights, more sleepless nights. Later, she walked to Mrs. Johnson's house, letter in hand. The older woman poured tea, listened in gentle silence as Jessica explained. "That man of yours was smart, honey," Clara said, patting her hand. "But this isn't just a gift. It's a test, too. Money like that. It changes people, if you let it. Don't forget what made you strong." Jessica nodded, staring into her mug. In the days that followed, she moved cautiously. She made no sudden purchases, let no hints slip. She studied the trust documents at night after the children slept, running her fingers over Daniel's signature as if it might bring him back for a moment. Some nights, she was flooded with gratitude. Other times, she lay awake, fearful. What if she failed him? What if the money unraveled all the careful, fragile bonds she'd built in this new world? The house remained humble. The roof still leaked, the windows rattled in the wind, but now there was a current of something new, a trembling hope, buoyed by responsibility. She poured herself into the children's routines, helping Chloe with math, cheering Mason at his baseball games, lending a hand at every block party and fundraiser. The secret trust sat quietly in the background, both shield and shadow. One evening, Jessica sat on the porch as dusk fell, letter in her lap, watching the kids play tag under the streetlights. The air smelled of cut grass and barbecue smoke. Daniel's words lingered. Do the right thing. Jessica closed her eyes and breathed in the moment, just the ordinary beauty of a life remade, and the promise that somehow she would find a way forward. It started with a letter, heavy and embossed with the Langston crest, a piece of mail Jessica recognized before she even picked it up from the porch. The world seemed to slow as she read it. Formal language, threats masked as concern, a legal summons folded crisp and cold as a winter wind. Edward and Victoria knew about the trust now, their intentions laid bare in a single chilling line. We believe you are unfit to manage the children's inheritance or their futures. That night, Jessica could barely sleep. She watched the shadows flicker across the ceiling, heart pounding, mind awash in all the old fears. The Langstons hadn't just come for her. They were coming for Chloe and Mason, for the home and community she'd built brick by humble brick. This time, they had lawyers, arguments, and a war chest as deep as old Boston money could go. Word spread quickly on Willow Street. By the next morning, Mrs. Johnson knocked with a fresh loaf of bread and a look of determined solidarity. Marcus showed up after work, toolbox in hand, offering to fix the wobbly banister. The neighborhood rallied around her with casseroles, notes tucked under the door, quiet words of support on the sidewalk. Still, the trial date arrived too quickly. Jessica found herself standing in a courthouse where the ceilings soared and the air felt thick with memory and judgment. Chloe wore her best dress, hair brushed until it shone. Mason fidgeted beside her, his hand tucked into Jessica's. She could feel the Langstons' eyes on them, cold and measuring. Edward was all posture and certainty, his suit flawless, his arguments sharp. Victoria sat beside him, face carefully composed, clutching a pearl-studded handkerchief. The proceedings unfolded in slow, punishing detail. Edward's attorney spoke of legacy, of tradition, of the dangers of unqualified guardianship. He questioned Jessica's every decision, her employment history, her bank statements, the rundown house on Willow Street. Victoria dabbed her eyes as their lawyer painted Jessica as overwhelmed and under-resourced. But Jessica refused to be broken on the stand. When asked about her work, she spoke plainly about early mornings and late nights, about the dignity of earning each dollar and the pride in providing for her children without shortcuts or charity. She described the community they'd found, their block parties, the playgrounds Chloe and Mason helped paint, the neighbors who had become family. The judge listened, and then the tide shifted. One by one, people from Willow Street arrived to testify. Mrs. Johnson spoke first, voice clear and unwavering. Jessica is the backbone of our street. She's the first to help, the last to complain. And those kids? They're thriving. Marcus shared stories of Jessica teaching Mason to fix a squeaky bike, Chloe's drawings brightening every house on the block. Chloe's teacher stepped forward, recounting Chloe's kindness to a classmate who had lost her home, Mason's leadership in organizing a canned food drive. Even Jessica's boss at the diner showed up, speaking of her reliability, her warmth, her fierce love for her family. The courtroom quieted as Chloe, shy but determined, handed the judge a drawing. Their little house with sunlight streaming through the patched roof, stick figures standing together. In crayon she'd written, "Home is where my mom is." Edward's arguments faltered. For the first time, his confidence cracked. Victoria sat rigid, tears finally spilling as she watched her granddaughter's earnest face. In her closing remarks, Jessica did not mention the trust fund. She spoke only of her children, of what Daniel had wanted, a life full of small joys, resilience, and a love that could not be bought or sold. The judge's verdict arrived with the soft thud of a gavel. Custody would remain with Jessica, as would stewardship of the trust. The decision cited not just financial security, but the overwhelming evidence of love, community support, and moral character. Jessica stood in the courthouse hallway, the world spinning back into color. Chloe hugged her waist. Mason squeezed her hand so tight it almost hurt. The Langstons slipped away, shadows stretching long and thin across the marble floor. Outside, the air was crisp and alive. Jessica exhaled for the first time in months. She didn't feel triumphant, just grateful, steady, and fiercely protective of what she'd rebuilt. That night, as the neighborhood gathered for a quiet celebration, Jessica raised a glass of lemonade in a trembling hand. She looked at her children, her friends, her home, and whispered a thank you to Daniel, promising to hold fast to the values that had carried them this far. Summer drifted in slow and golden on Willow Street, sunlight sifting through the maples, dust motes swirling in quiet kitchens. With the trial behind them, a strange hush settled over Jessica's home. Relief not as an outburst, but as a series of small, careful exhalations. Every corner seemed brighter, every step lighter. even if the floorboards still groaned and the roof still threatened to leak after each storm. Jessica found herself waking earlier, listening for the birds, the city's distant hum. She scrubbed and painted the porch, planted pansies along the path, patched cracks in the walls with her own hands. Each improvement, however small, made the house feel less like borrowed shelter and more like a home claimed with heart and effort. Marcus came by on weekends, hammer in hand, teaching Mason how to swing a nail straight and level. Mason, solemn with concentration, followed every instruction, a faint smile tugging at his lips when the door finally closed without a creak. Chloe spent afternoons with Mrs. Johnson, learning to knit and, more often, simply sitting together in the sun, 2 generations sharing stories, laughter skipping like pebbles across the hours. Inside, the transformation was quieter. The children no longer flinched when the mail arrived, or when Jessica's phone rang. Mason's shoulders lost their defensive set. Chloe began to invite friends over, their chatter spilling out onto the porch. The shadows that had trailed them from the Langston estate, thick with fear and doubt, began to thin. One Saturday, the school announced an art exhibition. Chloe hesitated at first, but Jessica encouraged her gently, reminding her that art wasn't about perfection, but about sharing what was inside. Chloe's submission, a painting titled "A Leaking House Full of Light," captured their new home with windows glowing warm against the dark, rain streaking the outside, laughter and color blooming within. At the exhibition, parents and teachers paused in front of her work, moved not by its polish, but by its hope. Jessica watched from the back of the room, pride welling quiet and deep. She remembered the nights spent mopping puddles from the kitchen, making up stories about rainbows hiding in the clouds, teaching Chloe and Mason how to find comfort in uncertainty. Seeing Chloe beam as her classmates praised her painting, Jessica knew the hard nights had not been wasted. Mason, inspired by his sister, took charge of a new project at school, a fundraiser for local families struggling with rent and groceries. He organized a bake sale, rallied his friends, and even convinced Marcus to teach the kids basic carpentry so they could build birdhouses to sell. On the day of the event, the schoolyard filled with laughter, flour-dusted faces, and rows of crooked but earnest birdhouses. The fundraiser raised enough to stock the local food pantry for weeks. Through it all, Jessica found herself growing too. She accepted help more easily, stopped apologizing for what she couldn't offer, and celebrated what she could. She learned to ask for advice, to say no when she needed rest, to trust that her worth was not measured by money or by anyone else's standards. The house, battered but bright, became a symbol. Neighbors stopped by not just to help, but to linger, sharing coffee on the porch, children chasing each other across the small patch of yard. Jessica organized a book swap in the living room. Soon, borrowed paperbacks stacked higher than the toaster, each one holding a note from a neighbor, a tiny thread weaving the community tighter. In quiet moments, rocking on the porch at sunset, listening to the children's voices rising through open windows, Jessica felt something unfamiliar settle in. Peace fragile and surprising. There were still worries, still bills to pay, and shoes to mend, but the fear no longer gnawed at her bones. One evening, as a gentle rain began to fall, Chloe curled up beside Jessica, her head on her mother's shoulder. "Do you think Daddy would like our house now?" she asked softly. Jessica smiled, watching Mason hammer the last board into a birdhouse, the porch lights spilling warmth into the dusk. "I think he'd love it, honey. I think he'd be proud of all of us." The rain tapped gently at the windows, not as a threat this time, but as a lullaby. In the glow of their small, repaired home, Jessica knew that the cracks would never fully disappear, but light could find its way through even the smallest break, making a place for hope to grow and for a family to finally begin again. It happened on a Thursday, unremarkable except for the brittle edge of autumn in the air, the way leaves spun gold and red across Willow Street. Jessica was pinning up invitations for the neighborhood harvest festival at the school when she saw the familiar silhouette just beyond the doors. Victoria Langston, perfectly composed in her tailored coat, clutching a handbag that seemed at odds with the art-splattered halls. Jessica's breath caught. For a moment she nearly turned away, years of hurt and pride bubbling to the surface. But Victoria didn't seem to notice Jessica standing there. Instead, she moved quietly through the hallway, pausing at the entrance to the gymnasium where Chloe's art show was being set up. Jessica followed at a distance, unsure, torn between the urge to protect and the old habit of bracing for judgment. She watched as Victoria stood in front of Chloe's painting, a leaky house painted bright from within, rain on the windows, sunlight streaming through every crack. Victoria's face, usually so controlled, softened. She pressed a gloved hand to her lips, her eyes shining with something Jessica hadn't seen before. Grief, perhaps, or regret. She stayed for a long time, studying Chloe's brushstrokes, until the crowd grew and she slipped quietly out a side door, unnoticed by everyone but Jessica. Later that week, the Harvest Festival filled the neighborhood with the scent of cinnamon and bonfires, laughter echoing under strings of paper lanterns. Mason was at the ticket booth, counting change with his friends, when Jessica noticed a tall figure at the edge of the crowd, Edward Langston, hands deep in his coat pockets, his posture hesitant. He watched Mason with a mixture of longing and uncertainty, pride warring with something older and heavier. For a while, though, he lingered near the bake sale, pretending to examine pies, but always glancing over at the children. Jessica felt a familiar ache, the urge to shut the door, to keep the circle small and safe. But she also remembered Daniel's words. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting, Jess. It's about leaving the door cracked, just in case someone is brave enough to walk through. She approached Edward slowly, the festival noise softening around them. "You can say hello, you know," she said, voice gentle, not accusing. Mason would like that. Edward's eyes flickered, his voice a rasp. I wasn't sure. After everything, he stopped, searching for words. He looked so much like Daniel at that age. I never told him that. Never told any of you enough. Jessica let the silence hold them for a moment. Maybe it's not too late, she replied, looking toward Mason, who was laughing in the firelight, his face open and bright. You can try if you want. Later, as the festival ended, Edward found Mason by the cider table and started a slow, awkward conversation. Mason listened, wary at first, but gradually his guard lowered. Jessica watched from across the field, her heart tight but hopeful. Days passed. Small gestures began to cross the distance that years of bitterness had built. Victoria sent a letter to Chloe, praising her painting and inviting her to visit the city's art museum. Mason received a box of old baseball cards from Edward, the collection carefully labeled, some with Daniel's notes in the margins. Jessica didn't rush forgiveness, nor did she forget the years of loneliness. She allowed visits to happen on her terms, always with the understanding that love could not be forced or bargained. But slowly, She saw the twins open themselves to the possibility of family, not as inheritance or legacy, but as fragile, human connection. One crisp afternoon, the Langstons joined Jessica and the kids for dinner at the Willow Street house. The meal was simple: roast chicken, homemade rolls, apple pie, but conversation flowed more easily than Jessica had dared hope. Chloe showed Victoria her latest sketchbook. Mason asked Edward to help fix a squeaky chair. For a few hours, the old wounds faded under the soft light of shared stories and new laughter. When the evening ended, Edward paused at the door, hesitating. "Jessica, thank you for letting us try again. For Daniel's sake, and for theirs." Jessica nodded, her reply quiet but certain. "We're not what we used to be, but maybe we can be something better." As the Langstons walked down the steps, Chloe slipped her hand into Jessica's, Mason trailing close behind. The family they were building wasn't perfect, and forgiveness wasn't a single moment, but a choice made again and again. Still, as Jessica watched her children smiling under the porch light, she felt hope, new and tentative but real, take root. The world turned again, as it always does, autumn slipping into the first chill of winter, the maples along Willow Street bare and trembling, the sky wide and sharp with stars. Inside their little house, Jessica stood at the kitchen window, watching her breath fog the glass. The kids were sprawled across the floor, piecing together a jigsaw puzzle, laughter spilling between them, music playing low from the radio. There was a quiet contentment here now, woven into the walls, steady as a heartbeat. It had been nearly a year since the trust fund's secret changed their path. Jessica had spent weeks wrestling with the possibilities, mapping out every way the money could help, and every way it might quietly harm. The answer, when it came, was almost simple. The money wasn't the point. It was a tool, and what mattered was how it shaped not just their lives, but the lives around them. And so, the Daniel Monroe Foundation was born, not with fanfare or headlines, but with a community meeting in the Willow Street church basement. Jessica wore her best dress, knees shaking, and stood before neighbors and friends, the Langstons, school teachers, and even Marcus with his ever-present mug of coffee. She spoke plainly, her voice steady as she explained the foundation's mission: scholarships for kids who dreamed big and worried about bills, funding for arts programs so every child could hold a brush or a violin, even if their parents couldn't afford it, help for families fighting to keep a roof overhead. The rules of the trust echoed in her words. This wasn't for luxury or status, but for building something lasting, something bigger than one family. There was no applause, just quiet nods, a sense of shared purpose. Later, as Jessica poured coffee and Chloe set out plates of cookies, people came forward to offer help. A retired accountant volunteering his time, Mason's principal suggesting families in need, Mrs. Johnson offering to teach a quilting class as a fundraiser. The opening ceremony, months later, was simple, just as Daniel would have wanted. No speeches, no press, just neighbors gathered on the little patch of grass outside the house, lanterns strung from the porch, steam rising from mugs of cocoa. The Langstons arrived too, no longer as adversaries, but as guests, each bringing a quiet gift. Victoria had sewn a quilt for Chloe. Edward handed Mason an old photo album of Daniel as a boy. Laughter caught forever in fading black and white. Jessica watched as Chloe led a tour of her newest art project. Bright murals painted along the schoolyard fence, every color bold against winter's gray. Mason darted around with his friends, pockets full of spare change for the food drive. The house, patched and painted, glowed soft in the dusk, a living testament to the messiness and beauty of starting again. As the crowd faded and the lanterns swayed in the night breeze, Jessica settled onto the porch steps with Chloe and Mason tucked close. The street was quiet, their breaths mingling in the cold air. She glanced down at her hands, calloused, unadorned, but stronger now than she ever could have imagined. After a long silence, Chloe rested her head on her mother's shoulder. "Do you miss him?" she whispered. Jessica drew in a slow breath, feeling the ache, but also the fullness. "Every day. But you know, what he left us wasn't just the money, or even this house, it's all of this." She gestured to the street, the laughter drifting from nearby windows, the faint glow of the foundation's sign in the neighbor's yard. "He taught us how to love, how to give, how to keep going when things get hard. That's what we carry forward." Mason leaned against her, quiet for a moment, then grinned. "I think Dad would have liked the new swings at the park." Jessica laughed, a soft, honest sound. "Yeah, I think he'd say you two did a pretty good job with all this." The night deepened, and the porch lights flickered. Jessica listened to her children breathing, to the slow, sure pulse of home around her. The family they'd built wasn't perfect, nor untouched by pain, but it was real, stitched together by courage, by kindness, by the ordinary magic of choosing each other day after day. And as she sat there, Jessica knew Daniel's legacy wasn't measured in dollars or even good deeds, but in every heart quietly changed by a second chance. Somewhere far off, a dog barked. The wind rattled the last leaves against the window, and the three of them, mother, daughter, son, sat in the hush, letting the world turn and the story linger.